Chapter 14, The Wheel of Powers. The first week after school break was like a gathering of the United Nations, as students returned from their home culture refreshed. Homework assignments and projects were piled on them daily, and there was a palpable tension in the hallways as students adjusted their pace from the leisurely stroll of holidays back to the race of academics. Raj arrived in the library the first day back at school. He was anxious to see the others, but he wasn't sure if he would tell them about his father. When Mei Ling arrived, he jumped up from his chair to greet her. "I'm so sorry, Mei Ling," he said, concern written all over his face. "Thank you, Raj," she said. "How are you?" "I'm not sure if I'm coping or not. Everything's a blur," she said. "I wish I could say something to help, but I don't know what." Raj thought about his dad and wondered why Mei Ling would lose hers. "It's okay, Raj. There's nothing to say, but thanks for trying." Emily rushed to Mei Ling, engulfing her in a hug. "Are you all right?" Emily pulled back to look closely at Mei Ling's face. "I guess," Mei Ling said quietly. "We have to do something," Emily said. "Ravana is trying to stop us." Solomon approached as Emily spoke. Mei Ling reached out a hand to welcome him. He took it and held it for a moment. "Emily's right," he said. "We have to keep going." "And fast," said Raj. "We have to conquer Ravana. She's going to keep throwing obstacles at us." "It'll be easier now that we can work together." Emily looked at Raj. "Yes," he said. They sat and waited for Mei Ling to take them into peace. After several minutes, it was obvious they were struggling to relax and focus their minds. "I wonder if we lost our touch over the break," said Solomon when nothing happened. "We're just out of practice," said Mei Ling. "Let's stick with it. Everyone try to concentrate." Raj felt the reassuring pull to silence. Since his dream, he hadn't been able to relax. It was such welcome relief to be able to do so now. In a few minutes, they were back on the platform in the round room. The colored pathways were waiting for them exactly as they had been before. They watched as the same man stepped from behind the magenta door and came toward them, yelling, as he had before. Emily descended from the platform and walked toward him just as he picked up the rocks and began to throw them. She knew that any attempt to stop him would only antagonize him. Instinctively, she moved closer to him and stood by his side. She watched as each rock left his hand, arced toward the group, and fell to the ground just before reaching the platform. He could not hurt her friends. Standing beside him, she quietly willed him to calm down. His rock throwing slowed, and Emily felt his anger subside. Then he dropped the rocks and sank to the floor, hunched at Emily's feet. "Looks like I'm doing okay this time," she said to the group on the platform. She felt calm inside, focused. The man let out a sob, then a deep wail, obviously suffering. Emily reached out and touched his shoulder, letting her hand rest there as he cried. Slowly, his crying subsided. She kept her hand there. Then suddenly, he put his hand over hers, the first indication that he was aware of her presence. He looked up at her, his dark eyes steeped in sadness that turned to warm gratitude. "Thank you," he said. He got up and walked down the pathway and disappeared through the doorway. "Wow, Emily," said Raj, as she climbed back onto the platform. "You handled that well. Even knowing it was the wrong thing to do, I still might have punched him." "Are you okay?" asked Mei Ling. Emily stopped to consider the question. "This time I could just see that he was suffering and he needed help calming down." She remembered all the time she had soothed Tess after an outburst or tantrum. This was something she was good at. She'd just forgotten last time because she was so preoccupied and irritated. "You did well, Emily," said Solomon. "Takes a lot of patience to calm someone down like that," said Mei Ling. Emily felt herself warming in their praise, hoping she had redeemed her past mistake. They stood on the platform together and waited for another door to open. Mei Ling stepped down the platform and walked the violet pathway, reaching the door just as it opened. She was thrown back as a rush of unseen energy burst through the doorway like a gust of wind. Phantom-like forms emerged and moved around her, dancing on the wall like projected images. The phantoms were images of Mei Ling with her shoulders hunched, head down, looking burdened and lacking confidence. With books hugged tightly to their chests, each was an accurate representation of Mei Ling at school. Then the voices began. They started as a whisper, then crescendoed to a roar. "You aren't good enough," taunted one of the phantoms. "You'll never succeed," shouted another. "Always alone," whined another. "What's wrong with you? You're so stupid." The voices harangued Mei Ling relentlessly. She stood frozen, stunned by the intensity of the verbal attacks reverberating around her. "You are wasting your time," one continued. "You will never make it." After her initial shock, she ducked her head in shame, aware that the others were listening. "No one wants you." The voices grew louder, and her mind was filled with their poisonous energy. She wanted to scream in pain. She could barely think. She slumped to the floor, defeated. "It's true what they're saying," she thought to herself. "I am a failure. I never seem to get it right." She repeated the litany of insults to herself, recognizing the familiar sound of her own inner voice. Then she heard Solomon's voice, mixed in with the phantoms. "Mei Ling, are you all right? Don't listen to them." She turned to look at him and saw something unexpected. Raj's face was filled with concern. Emily gave her a look of encouragement. Solomon looked defiant, ready to stand up to the phantoms. It gave her strength and courage. They were with her. These people she had only recently dared to call friends. Something inside Mei Ling snapped into place. She stood up with her shoulders back, her head held high, and a look of focused determination on her face. Her voice rose above the phantoms. "I'm not listening to you anymore," she said to the floating images. "I'm finished with you. Go away." As she spoke, the phantoms stopped moving. One by one, they dissolved, the terrible sound of their taunting voices leaving with them. The entire room vibrated with the sudden silence. As Mei Ling walked back to the platform, she heard a quiet voice from behind the door. "We will never leave." She turned and stood facing the empty air, solid like a stone statue. Speaking as much to herself as to the voice, she said, "Maybe not, but I will not listen to you anymore." She turned away from the door and climbed onto the platform. The others looked at her in awe, barely recognizing the confident person they saw in front of them. "You don't really have to deal with people saying things like that, do you?" asked Raj. "It sounds like that inside my head most of the time," she admitted. "For what it's worth, Mei Ling, I recognize some of those voices." Solomon's kind tone was free of pity. "It's time to let them go," she replied. They stood in silence on the platform. Mei Ling was quiet and reflective. Emily stood by her side in support. Both Raj and Solomon stood near the edge of the platform, prepared for action. "It's like an obstacle course, only we can't see the obstacles until they come out," said Raj. Suddenly, a burst of color flashed from the door at the end of the turquoise pathway. A clown stepped out, juggling as it walked toward them. Raj was mesmerized and left the platform, drawn to the scene before he was aware he had just committed himself to deal with it. When Raj was 3 feet from the clown, he stopped to watch, staring in wonder at his power, agility, and focus as he juggled several balls. Without warning, the clown threw one of the balls to Raj. Surprised, Raj caught it and looked at the ball in his hands. It seemed to have a life of its own and leapt into the air. The clown threw him another ball and another until Raj was holding all the balls. They leapt into the air of their own volition, returning to his outstretched hands, giving the impression that he was juggling just like the clown. Meanwhile, the clown, despite having no more balls, continued to make juggling motions next to Raj. Raj's hands began to fumble when he realized he had all the balls, but the precocious spheres continued to rise and fall of their own accord. He spread his feet further apart to stabilize himself, wondering how the balls continued to move. He felt pressure to keep the balls in the air, but was certain he would drop them. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His hands were clammy, and the veins in his neck bulged. "Help!" he yelled to the group. When Solomon tried to step onto the pathway, he banged into an invisible wall. "You're on your own, I'm afraid, Raj. We can't get off the platform," said Solomon. Raj was clearly stressed, feeling a need to perform as he juggled all the balls. "I don't even know how to juggle," he screamed, unable to stop interacting with the balls. The others watched as Raj gradually relaxed. He was beginning to enjoy the odd sensation. His shoulders dropped, he stood taller, and he moved effortlessly like a dancer as the balls moved in and out of his hands. At the moment when he felt completely comfortable, the balls froze in the air, hovered above his head, then descended one at a time into his outstretched hands, inert. He looked at the clown, confused. The clown carefully and with great show retrieved each of the balls from Raj's arms. Once they were gathered, he bowed to the platform and disappeared through the doorway. Raj returned to the platform, a puzzled look on his face. "Great show, Raj," Solomon smirked as Raj climbed onto the platform. "One minute you were completely overwhelmed and uncomfortable, and then you seemed to relax and get into it," said Mei Ling. "It was amazing to watch. Well done." "I didn't think you could go with the flow like that, Raj," said Emily. Her surprise brought a small smile to Raj's face. "I didn't know I could either," he thought, momentarily proud of himself. The room was silent and still for a moment. "You're next, Solomon. We've each had a turn," said Emily. "One challenge per door, 8 doors, and 4 of us," said Mei Ling. "This is a test of power, like the book said." Her demeanor was more confident since her encounter with the phantoms. Suddenly, a pitiful moan filled the room, a long, low wail of pain, sadness, and misery like a dying animal. An old woman appeared at the green door and began walking toward them, her hand outstretched, her walk slow and crippled, pain evident in her every step. Solomon jumped from the platform and rushed to her. She reminded him of his grandmother. When he was closer, Solomon could see that her face was covered in sores that were swollen with pus. Her hands were red and raw, as if she had spent a lifetime washing clothes in buckets of bleach. "Please, please," she begged, reaching out for his help. His stomach wrenched with pity as he stretched his hand out to meet hers. Then suddenly he stopped. Something made him pull away just before making contact. He knew he couldn't risk touching her. The lesions on her skin appeared infectious. There was nothing he could do to help except comfort her. "It's okay," he said soothingly. "What's wrong? How can I help?" The woman did not respond. She continued to moan and was now grasping to get his hand. Something didn't seem right to Solomon. He didn't like how he was feeling, a horrible mix of revulsion and helplessness. The pitiful look on the woman's face was intensifying, urging him to respond, but he kept his distance, reason overriding his instinct to reach out and help. As he stood reflecting, something inside of him shifted. Suddenly, rather than pity, he felt detached, curious to see what was really happening in front of him. He looked at the woman more closely to see what was in her eyes. As he did, her form began to change. Her body crumpled like modeling clay, folding in on itself, and a new form began to take shape. The woman's outstretched hand became a pincer, ready to pierce him. He recoiled instantly when he saw that the new shape was a giant scorpion. He thought about running away, but the shape continued to change. He wanted to see what would be next. The hard shell of the scorpion's body softened and morphed into a new shape. The scorpion became an old man, sitting on the ground in front of Solomon with a deck of cards in his hands and a pile of coins at his feet. He was gambling. Then, as quickly as the man shape had formed, it disappeared completely, and Solomon was left standing alone on the green pathway. He was dazed for a moment and stared into the empty space where the man had been. Then he turned and walked back to the platform. "What was that?" Raj asked. "You didn't have to do anything." "It's what he didn't do that saved him," said Emily. "You looked like you were going to touch the old woman, but you didn't. Why?" asked Mei Ling. "Something didn't feel right," Solomon said, "but I didn't know what." "In India, we have a story called the Ramayana," Raj said slowly. "It's a story of a queen who is told to stand inside the line of protection so a demon won't get her. But then a beggar comes and she crosses the line out of pity. Then the beggar turns into Ravana, the 10-headed demon, who kidnaps her and makes her a slave for 14 years. "You think that's what that beggar lady might have done to Solomon?" asked Emily. "Maybe," said Raj. "Maybe this power is about seeing things for what they really are," said Mei Ling. "Okay, my turn," said Emily, as she stepped off the platform. She walked toward the door at the end of the blue path, quickly at first, then more slowly as she got closer. When she reached the door, it remained closed. She stood in front of it awkwardly waiting, then reached to open it. Peering inside, she saw nothing but darkness. She hesitated and looked back at the others. Before they could gesture or say anything, she stepped through the door. The last thing she heard as she crossed the threshold was Solomon yelling for her to be careful. His voice disappeared and all sound was swallowed in the vast silence of the space she had entered. Somewhere off to the right, she saw the warm glow of a light. She looked at the walls around her and realized she was in a cave with a small fire burning in the center. The walls were smooth and cool to the touch. She made her way to a low bench next to the fire and felt herself completely alone in a place of dead silence. She sat on the bench and waited quietly. She couldn't remember ever having been this removed from the outside world. "This is your natural state of being. You have forgotten." The voice was soothing and kind, but very powerful, like the voice in her dream. "What?" she asked, as much to hear the voice again as to clarify its meaning. "There is a place inside of you that has not been touched by the outside world," said the soothing voice. She smiled around the room, wondering if someone was watching her. "Do you hear their cries?" asked the voice. In that moment, she heard cries of distress and moans of worry, stress, and fear. The words surrounded her like the sound in a movie theater. They were familiar, like the students and people she passed on the street every day. Their collective misery was overwhelming. She cringed in pain, sucked into their suffering. The cries made her feel helpless and hopeless. As she listened, something happened. She felt slightly removed from it, as if the silence of the room protected her from feeling the pain, even though she could hear it. In that moment, she felt her heart swelling with love, and she reached out with her mind to offer comfort. She stayed in front of the fire for a long time, even after the soothing voice left her. Finally, she rose, her feet steady as she stepped through the door. The serenity on her face and the stillness in her eyes silenced Solomon's questions. She returned to the platform and smiled at them. Her eyes were gentle and encouraging, and her look melted something in Raj. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Yes." Her voice was soft but strong. "I realize how important it is to not be affected by all the misery around us." She described her experience in the room, watching as Mei Ling nodded in understanding. They stood in silence for a few moments until Raj said, "Okay, I'll go." He walked deliberately toward the door at the end of the red pathway, apprehensive about what he might encounter. The door opened and a table rolled out. It was covered by a white tablecloth with a trophy and a framed picture positioned on top. Curious to see what was in the picture, he stepped closer. He gasped when he saw that it was a photograph of himself as an old man, wearing a business suit and looking very dignified. "It's me," he called over his shoulder, excitement overriding his usual cool demeanor. The photograph showed him shaking hands with an older, gray-haired European gentleman who was also wearing a fine suit. The gentleman was handing him a trophy, the one that was on the platform next to the photo. "I must have won some kind of award for my work," he yelled back to the platform. He bent to see the picture more closely and noticed that it had changed slightly. In fact, it wasn't a picture of Raj at all. It was a picture of his grandfather, receiving an award for his humanitarian work during the time of partition in India. Raj felt his cheeks flush. He hoped his friends couldn't see his embarrassment. He stopped for a moment and faced the picture directly. He felt a giant weight crushing his chest and his self-image. "I've never done anything to deserve an award," he thought. He suddenly thought of the recent news report from India about a factory fire that had killed 69 children as they worked. His father was named as the industrialist who owned the factory. Raj was horrified when he learned that the rumors he had so tried to deny were true. He wondered what his relationship with his father would become. He bowed slightly to the picture of his grandfather, remembering how many times his mother had encouraged him to follow in his grandfather's footsteps. "Lesson learned, Mummy," he said to himself, and walked back to the platform. "What happened, Raj?" asked Mei Ling. "I haven't done anything to deserve an award. That was a picture of my grandfather, not me," he said humbly. He avoided eye contact and stared down at his feet. Then he sat on the edge of the platform and looked toward the closed door. Clearly, Dad has forgotten grandfather's example too, he thought. Emily, Solomon, and Mei Ling watched Raj, unsure of what to say. Finally, Emily placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's hard to face the truth sometimes," she said gently. Raj looked up at her and gave her a small smile. Solomon looked at Mei Ling, wondering which of them would go next. Her eyes did not meet his. She wasn't quite ready. So Solomon left the platform and walked down the golden pathway. As he approached the door, he felt his confidence draining, and he began to wonder if he was up for the next challenge. What would it reveal about him? Would he be able to handle it? He had the feeling he might let the others down. He stood in front of the door, self-doubt washing over him. When nothing happened, he glanced back at the others and noticed the pathway behind him was rolling up like a carpet, cutting him off from the platform. He rushed back to the edge to meet the edge of the path as it continued to roll itself toward him. He wouldn't be able to get back to the platform without the pathway. He tried to cross to the next path, but his foot fell through the space into nothingness. "Solomon, do something!" yelled Emily. He looked to the other side. The neighboring paths were getting farther away as the golden pathway continued to roll itself up. He would have to leap across the space between pathways. Any delay would make the distance greater. He leapt and landed safely on the red path, panting with relief, then ran back to the platform. "What was that about?" asked Mei Ling, releasing her grip on Emily's arm. "I don't know, but there wasn't much time to think." Solomon shook his head. "It's good you acted quickly, or who knows what would have happened," Emily said. Then Solomon realized something. "My self-doubt completely disappeared the minute I took action," he said. Mei Ling looked at the orange pathway, knowing it was her turn. She hesitated, then left the platform and walked slowly toward the door, not knowing what to expect. The phantom voices were still fresh in her mind as she stopped halfway to the door and looked back at the group. Solomon called, "Do you want us to come with you?" He stepped off the platform, surprised that nothing prevented him from doing so this time. Emily and Raj joined him, walking together to stand by Mei Ling. When they reached the door, they waited for it to open, but nothing happened. Mei Ling pushed against it, but it did not budge. An envelope appeared from under the door, pushed toward them from the other side. It was a creamy color with a gold seal on the back. There was no writing on the outside. Mei Ling opened it and pulled out a piece of parchment paper, embossed with gold edges. She unfolded it so they could see the words written across the page in gold script. To cooperate is to have a quiet eye for what is needed to bring success, to supply it at the right time, in the right place, and in a positive state of mind. Cooperation is the greatest of all powers. When they finished reading, the envelope and the parchment vanished from Mei Ling's hands. The scene changed, and they were back in the library, standing around the dictionaries. "That was amazing," Emily enthused. Mei Ling considered for a moment. "I loved this section of the book. It was all about inner power. I like the idea that there's another kind of power in the world." "So was this about the power we have or the power we need?" asked Solomon. Good question. Maybe both," Mei Ling replied. "For instance, Emily's usually pretty tolerant, so it didn't surprise me that she could handle the guy with the rocks, at least now that she's feeling calmer and more focused." Emily smiled. "Thanks," she said. "I guess I am pretty accepting of others, but I do have a hard time being quiet and still, so the quiet room was good for me. I liked it." "And you definitely know how to cooperate, Mei Ling," Solomon said. "I admire the way you're always ready to help sort things out." He smiled at her. "But I'm also swamped with negative voices in my head. I really need to be able to shut them down and let them go," Mei Ling added. Yeah, and I need to be more decisive," Solomon said, "especially when I start doubting myself." "But you're good at seeing things for what they really are," Emily said. Raj was silent. Emily looked at him. "What about you, Raj?" she asked. He responded in a hoarse whisper. "Why did I get the juggling? You're the one who's good at juggling a bunch of things." "Well, maybe that's the power you want to have more of, Raj," Mei Ling said. "You did really well with it, though." "It's obvious I didn't have the other power either, the one about facing the truth. I immediately assumed that was me in the picture," Raj said quietly. Then, as if speaking to himself, he said, "I'm not sure I have any of these powers." No one said anything. They had never heard Raj speak like this before. It was so quiet they could hear their hearts beat. Finally, Mei Ling said, "It's okay, Raj. You did face it. We saw you face it. And you're very decisive. And you probably wouldn't tolerate any of those phantom voices in your head," added Emily. Solomon nodded, but Raj was unmoved. Mei Ling placed her hand lightly on his. "We're all learning, Raj. I think that's the point." The next day, Solomon found Ben in the library, bent over a book, his forehead furrowed in concentration. "I don't get it, Solomon. I try, but I can't sort out all the letters. I'm supposed to read this out loud tomorrow in class, and I can't do it." His eyes were red, and Solomon could tell he'd been crying. "But you love to read." Solomon put his arm around Ben's shoulder and sat next to him at the desk. Ben's book was propped open, and a shiny silver pen lay across the open pages. Solomon cursed Ravana silently. "Leave him alone. He's only a kid," he yelled in his head. "Maybe I'm just not that smart." Ben rubbed his eyes. "That's not true, Ben. Listen, the bus is about to leave. Let's go home. I'll look at that book of yours in the bus. Maybe they wrote it in Chinese." "Can I wear your jacket on the bus?" Ben looked longingly at Solomon's basketball jacket. Solomon took it off and draped it over Ben's small body. "There, all yours for the ride home." Solomon smiled and rubbed Ben's head. Ben looked up at his big brother and the furrow in his brow dissolved. When they got home, Solomon greeted the IE with his usual smile, the only communication possible with their different languages. He settled in a chair at the dining room table to help Ben with his reading. After an hour, Ben was more confident with it, and Solomon went to his bedroom to check in with the others. "Hey, you there?" he typed. "Here," said Emily. "So what was that last secret about?" Solomon typed, "The true nature of power?" Raj was also online, still humbled by his experience. "I don't understand how these powers work," he said. "My mom used to be a social activist," said Emily. "She said she just got more and more angry fighting for peace until she started meditating. Now she says she gets the power of peace from meditating." "Well, how does meditating help?" said Raj. "Well, she says if we want to create peace in the world, we have to be peaceful, not just talk about peace. Like Gandhi said, we have to be the change we want to see in the world. Mum calls meditation inner activism." "Well, that's kind of cool," said Solomon. "I like that. Maybe that's what Mr. Wilson meant when he talked about soft power." "Yeah, but that's not how the world works," said Raj. "Hard power means you can get what you want. That's why Ravana likes it so much." "But maybe that's the point," said Emily. "Maybe the world needs a new kind of power. We've had enough of hard power. Look where it's got us." Solomon typed, "More war and conflict. Didn't Gandhi say an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind?" Raj typed, "I still don't see how these powers could help a small country or a group of oppressed people or a defenseless child." "Well, I think that's the point," said Emily. "The cycle of violence will only end when we start using a different kind of power." Solomon typed, "But it would take huge courage to do that, the way the world is today." And Raj typed, I guess that's why Gandhi was so great."